This is Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamian. This program features Peter Dale Scott on the politics of global drug trafficking. Crusades against drugs are a routine part of the political landscape. Drug wars are declared with great solemnity. Czars are appointed and task forces are formed. Billions of dollars are appropriated. Mandatory sentencing is enacted, and more prisons are built to house offenders. Yet, like dandelions, drugs just won't go away. Ever since Alfred McCoy's landmark book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, evidence has accumulated that covert U.S. involvement with regimes and movements has exacerbated the international drug problem. Afghanistan and Pakistan are just two recent notorious examples of U.S. policy. Peter Dale Scott is an expert on the politics of global drug trafficking. A former Canadian diplomat and UC Berkeley professor, he's co-author of Cocaine Politics, Drugs, Armies, and the CIA in Central America, and the Iran-Contra Connection, Secret Teams and Covert Operations in the Reagan Era. Peter Dale Scott spoke at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado.
I think what I really want to focus on primarily is the extent to which global drug trafficking has been reinforced and increased by right-wing U.S. interventions in other parts of the world, especially since World War II, and how the two of them continue to reinforce each other today. This has been written about quite a lot now. The classic example is Italy, where the Americans in 1948 were frightened the communists might win an election there, and so they went in and beefed up all of the right-wing elements, including the mafia in Sicily, which at the time was almost a completely defeated organization because Mussolini, nobody can be wrong all the time, and one of the things that Mussolini had done had almost crushed the mafia in Sicily. The Americans were frightened that this would open up Sicily to a communist takeover, and almost everybody knows how powerful the mafia is in Sicily today. It hasn't always been that way. It is that way today largely as a result of U.S. policies towards Italy after World War II. And that's sort of a paradigm of what I want to talk about generally in country after country. France, Indochina, Thailand, Central America, you name it, over and over again, where we see major drug trafficking today, we see over and over that it is in areas where the social structure of that country has been skewed by right-wing U.S. intervention at one moment or another. Now, all through the Cold War, of course, the United States justified what they were doing by saying, well, the communists there, the Kremlin, Stalin, is supporting the communists in Italy, the communists in France, and therefore it's a completely unfair and doomed contest unless we do the same thing on the other side. Without trying to get too severe about what happened during the Cold War, I'd like to say now the Cold War is over. There is no Kremlin in the old sense anymore, certainly no international communist movement. If the Cold War is over and we realize that we have a major drug problem in this country, then one of the things we should stop doing is propping up drug-corrupted regimes in other parts of the world, like Peru, like Guatemala, and let those countries work out their own futures and take all that money, over 150 billion, perhaps quite a lot more than 150 billion, which has been spent on hopeless interdiction programs, trying to stop drugs from coming into this country, that obviously haven't worked, if in some cases may actually have augmented the amount of drugs coming in. Take all that money and apply it to more humane and human-based solutions to the drug problem at home. I think most Americans are dimly aware that when we had the Vietnam War, particularly the height of it between 68 to 75, we also had a heroin epidemic in the United States, a good deal of that heroin coming from the so-called Golden Triangle. When the Vietnam War was ended, that flow of opium and heroin into this country fell off very dramatically. In fact, from 1975 to 84, the opium production in the Golden Triangle fell from 200 tons a year to about 30 tons a year. And there were other reasons why it fell. There was a drought and so on. But undoubtedly, one of the reasons was there just weren't so many planes flying back and forth between the United States and Indochina. I think people are vaguely aware also that when America, in its wisdom, chose to support the Contras against the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua, and in connection with that, beefed up a rather corrupt and rather militarized government in Honduras, we had a very sharp rise in the amount of cocaine that was flowing into this country precisely through Central America, anywhere from a fifth to a third or perhaps even more of it coming through Honduras, where the CIA was actually dealing with the leading drug trafficker in Honduras, and the U.S. State Department was renting planes from his own private airline, Setco, in order to support the Contras. What you may be less aware of, and I'd almost actually like to ask this audience, I assume you're an audience, how many people roughly knew something like what I just told you already? Most people. How many people are aware that perhaps even more dramatically, we had this problem with heroin from the Afghan-Pakistan border, which increased from, we had almost no such heroin coming into this country in 1979, which was the year that, under Carter, I may say, the Democratic president, Zbigniew Brzezinski in the National Security Council decided to give support to various guerrilla bands in Afghanistan, which he knew were supporting themselves from the drug traffic. And that by official published figures, the heroin in this country from that region went from about 0% of the total in 1979 to over 50% by 1984, but by a secret Reagan document had already reached over 50%, maybe 60% by 1981. That is how dramatic the increase in the flow of drugs into this country. And it was the same story as Vietnam and the Contras all over again. The same trucks in Pakistan that took the arms up to the frontier were the trucks that brought the heroin back down, and they had heroin labs up there. And that heroin found its way to the United States. In fact, there was a famous pizza connection in New York, and there have been books about it, a movie about it, I believe. 80 to 90% of that heroin was coming from this thing. How many people had a vague idea about that? See, almost nobody. Far fewer people. There was some publicity to the Contra drug problem in the 1980s, but there was virtually none about the Afghan heroin problem, which in terms of quantity was much greater. And this leads to where I think I'd like to end my talk. I'd like also to bring it in at the beginning, the problem of the press in this country. I'm going to tell you things, a lot of things, which you may find hard to believe. Some of them I find hard to believe. One of the reasons it's hard to believe them that there's so little about this in the United States press. And in fact, there's almost an inverse relationship. As the problem gets bigger, more often than not, if there's government policy involved, as there was in Afghanistan, the press coverage drops. So there had been something in the New York Times about the drug trafficking of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1979 and 1980. In fact, there was a warning in the New York Times, an op-ed piece by somebody who was in the White House supposed to be getting the documents on Afghanistan because he was in charge of drug policy, and he realized suddenly he had been cut out. Again, this was by the Carter administration. And he warned that we might have a problem on our hands. Well, I've researched the New York Times index, and there was not a single further story on Afghanistan, Mujahideen, and heroin until the middle of 1986, which is about the time that the Reagan administration decided that the drug problem was now so bad that they had to disengage from these Mujahideen. So in that crucial 6-year period where the heroin went from 0% to 60%, we heard exactly nothing about it in the press. And this is a depressing phenomenon, but also in a way a ray of hope. It means that if we can rouse popular consciousness on this thing and get the right degree of public interest in this topic, we can force the press to do its job properly, and I believe that that is a major factor in order to changing a drug policy which, in terms of its international aspects in this country, is, I think, still almost completely crazy. And by all kinds of expert accounts from inside the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, and now the Clinton administration, a policy which hasn't worked and has represented a waste of money. Unless you happen to be interested in something else, like suppressing guerrillas in Colombia or Peru, that is a different story. But in terms of efficacy in actually stopping drugs from coming to this country, not efficient at all. Now, I don't claim fully to understand this problem. I don't think anyone fully understands it. We're talking about an illicit traffic, so it isn't reported to the Census Bureau and to the Department of Labor and the way other things are. I just want to say this traffic completely dominates North-South relations, and increasingly I believe it's going to dominate East-West relations as well, and particularly our relations with Russia. By converting Russia into a capitalist state, we have helped convert it into a major drug trafficking area, and there are very important links between the mafia in Russia and the mafia in Brooklyn. And it turns out that, as so many times before, some of the key figures in that Brooklyn mafia that have links to Russia are protected. They cannot be arrested. The police are told to stay away from them because they have something to do with who knows what covert operations that are still being sanctioned by the CIA. It's very dangerous to try and give figures here, but the CIA itself, back in 1981, came up with an estimate of the size of the global drug trade. Newspapers and periodicals at the time were guessing it was maybe 150 billion a year. The CIA initially told Reagan that it was more like 300 billion a year, and then they discovered one marijuana field in Mexico, that this one field had 10,000 hectares in it, which meant they had to double their estimate of marijuana production in Mexico, and they came up with an estimate of 500 billion. Now, that figure was probably too high, because when you go to the DEA and the FBI for estimates of the drug trade, they tend to give very high estimates because that's how they get a bigger budget in next year's thing. So it may not be 500, may not have been 500 billion. It may only have been 150 billion, so that I think is a bit low. A way of understanding these inconceivably large figures is to consider that in that same year, the total legitimate trade in the world, all of it, every country with every other country, was about $1 trillion. So that if the CIA had been right, then 500 billion would have represented a figure which was half to the total of all legitimate trade. I'm a little bit comparing apples and oranges here, but I just want to give you the sense that it dominates trade, and in many, many different ways. A figure that I think is probably more reliable, also from the CIA in 1981, which was that Colombia and Mexico were generating 75% of their foreign exchange earnings, let's say dollars, through the drug trade. Now, this was at a time when U.S. banks, the biggest banks, and above all Citibank, one of the biggest of all, were very overexposed in Latin American debt. And I'd like you to think for a moment, if it's true that 75% of the foreign exchange earnings of Mexico were coming from the drug trade, and Citibank knew that Mexico had to meet its debt payments to Citibank, or not only was Mexico going to go bankrupt, but Citibank was going to go bankrupt, and this was talked about in the early 1980s. You can see that American bankers might have rather ambivalent feelings about the drug trade. The one country that has consistently been able to meet its debt payments without a problem through all the good years and the bad years has been Colombia, because cocaine has become the #1 export of Colombia, and there's nothing like it. It beats coffee and it beats oil, it beats all the traditional things in terms of meeting your balance of payments. I think it's dangerous to go on too much about the economics. I wanted to have a chapter in Cocaine Politics about this, and my co-author, who's not as crazy as I am, said, look, people are going to have trouble believing this book anyway, and we're solidly documented on the politics, and the economics is harder to document. Just because the CIA says it's true, it isn't necessarily true, so let's not put it in the book. And I didn't put it in the book, and that's one reason I'm sharing it with you now. It's the frustration I had at not being able to talk about it in the book, because I think that the economics are obviously, even if no one fully understands them, they are extremely important when, for example, marijuana is the #1 agricultural product from California, which is an agricultural state, and may be the #1 agricultural product in the United States. We're talking about something that's important. But I'm here to talk to you about the politics of the drug traffic. Now, right now, the U.S. is involved in the internal politics of Colombia, of Peru, of Guatemala, and of Mexico. Other countries too, but these are 4 big countries where where there are revolutionary movements, guerrilla movements, and where we are allied with right-wing forces in those same countries, which are in turn involved in one way or another, but in all 4 of those countries involved with the drug traffic in those countries. In fact, the revelations recently from Mexico have made it clear that the involvement of the ruling party, PRI, and the management of the drug trade in Mexico are almost two faces of the same institution, and I will be coming back to Mexico later in my talk. We are sending money to, and troops and helicopters, Vietnam all over again, in Peru, and to a lesser extent in Colombia, in the name of fighting drugs. But we are sending it to armed forces and to police forces who are themselves involved with the drug traffic. The drug traffic is on our side, not on the other side. And in Colombia, for example, a lot of the small arms that we have shipped to Colombia have ended up in parts of Colombia where there are no drugs at all. There are only guerrillas. And it is very clear that our support for a war on drugs in Colombia is being deflected and converted into that country's war on guerrillas. I'm not here to say guerrillas are good and governments are bad, but I am saying that it is being consciously diverted from the purposes which were explained to Congress when those funds were voted. And particularly in Peru, I think we run the risk of another Vietnam situation where in the end the very planes that are sent over there to keep drugs from coming into this country may be the planes which bring the drugs back to the United States, as certainly the planes sent to Vietnam repeatedly brought drugs back to the United States. So I'm saying as a practical message, if we want to do something about our terrible drug problem in this country, which has just devastated whole neighborhoods, you don't have to go very far in most of the major cities of the United States to see what terrible results, the social costs of drugs in this country. Is take those funds that are currently being spent down there and not achieving their goal and redirect them to demand-side solutions in drug rehabilitation programs, drug education programs. Clinton, incidentally, was elected on a program of promise to do just that, but now that the bureaucracy is getting to him, things are tilting back the other way. Now, I should make clear that I am not saying that the CIA and the U.S. military are themselves as agencies consciously drug trafficking or setting out to support the drug traffic. That is not the main problem. Now, in the case of the CIA, there have been some rather hairy moments in its history where CIA individuals have trafficked in drugs, and more spectacularly in Vietnam, where an entire CIA airline, Air America, became the means by which the Hmong or Mao tribesmen's opium and heroin was shipped out to the rest of the world because they were entirely surrounded by Pathet Lao, that is to say, enemy forces at the time. That has obviously added to the problem, but that is not the problem that I'm talking about either. The problem that I'm talking about is that, as I've already said, over and over, all around the world, the CIA, facing left-wing enemies, collaborates with right-wing forces who are already implicated in the drug trade, and with both directly with drug traffickers and with their political allies. Laos was perhaps an extreme situation, but it wasn't just the Mao Hmong tribesmen who were growing opium and processing it into heroin to be flown out on Air America planes. We were essentially paying the wages of the Royal Laotian Army, the head of which ran the largest heroin refinery in Laos. And everybody knew it in Laos, but you couldn't get anybody in the State Department or the CIA to admit it. And as I say, that's an extreme instance, but the reason why Southeast Asia has been such a recurring source of heroin is because, to a greater or lesser extent, we did do the same thing in Thailand, in Taiwan, and disastrously again in the 1980s in Afghanistan. So in all these countries, you get politically protected drug traffickers. There's a word that's grown up since World War II, the word kingpin. What is a kingpin? A kingpin is somebody who is running the traffic, and the reason, almost invariably in the third world, he is running the traffic is because he is the man with the connection, the man who has made some kind of deal with the local police or with the local military. It's usually the G2 or intelligence department of the military, or with all of the above, and who may or may not, the kingpin may be called upon to supplement the amount of violence that's been inflicted on the population, because drug traffickers are, it's not just that they have money, they have their own troops, and their own troops are well trained in just the sort of thing that the CIA frequently wants to see done in other countries, killing people selectively or in a large kind of way. I'm going to take a couple of countries and look at them in more detail, but this is the overall problem. And so that the result of CIA interventions all over the world, even if it's not the conscious intention of what the CIA has set out to do, is to create a global system of mutually connected kingpins who all trade with each other, are all protected by their local governments. And so, in a classic way, in the time of the Contras, cocaine could start in Bolivia or Peru, where it was protected, go to Colombia would be coca up there, would be processed in Colombia, where again they had connections in the government, transshipped by long flying planes to areas like Honduras or Guatemala or Mexico, and then offloaded into smaller places, or the Bahamas, I shouldn't leave them out, and then every step along the line, these people are protected by their connections in the government. And then finally, the last step is to get it into the United States. I should point out that the CIA is not the only intelligence agency in the world that has collaborated with drug traffickers. Our problem is not just that they happen to be our agency, it's also that they are, certainly at this point, the largest such agency, and therefore the biggest single influence in this global system that I'm talking about. The CIA did not invent this practice. Largely, the problem we have here is that up till World War II, a good deal of the Third World was dominated by imperial systems from Europe, which, particularly the British and the French, in one way or another, had been founded on the drug traffic back in the 18th and 19th century, when the drug traffic was legal, and which in the case of England was the foundation of the British Empire.
You're listening to Peter Dale Scott on the politics of global drug trafficking. This is Alternative Radio. If you'd like to get copies of this program, please call the following toll-free number, 1-800-444-1977. Stay tuned at the end for complete details on ordering.
The sort of root economy of the British imperial system was a triangular trade that went. Opium was grown in India. They were very moral. They wouldn't allow it to be sold in India. They would ship it straight out to China. China didn't want it, but they fought an opium war and forced China to take it in the name of free trade. America, too, John Quincy Adams said that the Chinese were violating the laws of God by trying to violate free trade and keep opium out of China. Those words and that trade have certainly come back to haunt us now in the United States when we are trying to do ourselves what the Chinese did. And then that opium trade to China paid for tea, which was then shipped to England. The tax on tea paid for the entire British Navy and therefore was the financial key to the British imperial system. And then finally, the tea paid for Manchester cotton goods, which were shipped to India and forced, I think is the word, on the Indian population at the expense of the native Indian industries. That was all legal in the 19th century. And it led to a system where both the British and the French colonies in Asia, in Southeast Asia at any rate, financed their government expenses by controlling what they call the opium farm. They just saw to it that opium was sold in the colonies and they taxed it. And when America took over from France, and to a lesser extent England in that area, it inherited a system in which drug trafficking was part of that imperial system. The whole social structure reflected this. We chose to preserve that social structure, and so in 1954, when the French moved out of Saigon and General Lansdale and the CIA moved in, one of the first things they did was, Lansdale did, was capture control of the local drug traffic, which was then run for a decade by Ngo Dinh Diem's brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and his wife. And that was not a novelty, that was a continuation of an older system. I really want to talk more about Central America, Latin America, and the two key countries, I think now, of Guatemala and Mexico. Guatemala is a kind of paradigm of what might have happened and what has happened instead. After a decade or so of a tyrant, Ubico, who was very much like Somoza in Nicaragua, the Americans were happy to see him go because he had been a little too close to Hitler in World War II. And you had the makings of a liberal bourgeois democracy in Guatemala. But liberal democracies get crazy ideas, and the leader of Guatemala, Arbenz, thought, well, look, United Fruit has millions of acres of jungle which they aren't using. We won't nationalize the banana fields that they are using. We will just nationalize the land that they aren't using. And the result was a CIA coup which toppled Arbenz and in the process destroyed the hopes for liberal democracy in Guatemala, with a legacy which down to the present, what do we say, 60,000 dead, 80,000 killed, 100,000 killed, certainly one of the most repressive systems, and also one which is corrupted by drugs. It's interesting to see that it was not corrupted by drugs right away, that the man whom the CIA actually installed, Colonel Castillo Armas, was in his own way a Puritan and a conservative, and he was trying to preserve Guatemala as it was with United Fruit in place. The American mob arrived rather soon afterwards, encouraged by the second fruit company, Standard Fruit, who were being squeezed out by United Fruit, and they tried to get a casino in Guatemala, and Castillo Armas said no. The next thing you knew, Castillo Armas had been murdered. A new military team had taken over. They were pleased to have a casino. And the man who had been approached by John Roselli on behalf of the U.S. mob was now running the counterinsurgency effort in Guatemala. Many, many radical historians have looked at the rise of counterinsurgency in Guatemala solely from the point of view of what the U.S. government did. But one of the reasons that Washington finds it so difficult now to change anything, it's a terrible embarrassment now to administrations in Washington, the amount of murder that there has been in Guatemala. But when you get a human rights president like Carter, for example, who wants to do something about it, the military says, okay, we won't take your dirty money, and instead they traffic in drugs. And there was, in fact, human rights abuses in some countries increased when Carter was president, because as long as they were having to answer to the military, they had to, there was a certain amount of decorum involved. You had to kill people in the back streets and not in the front streets. But there was a reorganization of counter-terror, counterinsurgency, all these various militaries, El Salvador, Guatemala, under the leadership of the Argentinian generals, 1976 to 1980. Which was essentially a drug-financed system. And in fact, there was a famous cocaine coup in Bolivia, which virtually installed the drug traffickers in control of Bolivia. The idea was it would pay for counterinsurgency all over the region. This was not anti-American. In fact, one of the people who rose to power in this period, Colonel D'Aubuisson, in El Salvador, was someone who simultaneously went to the School of the Americas and then went to an Argentine-sponsored conference in which drug traffickers and the military intelligence people were plotting together, including my favorite man, Mario Sandoval Alarcón from Guatemala, who was very important at that point. He's not himself a military man, but of course Carter was cutting back on direct aid to the military. So the godfather of all the death squads in all the countries of Latin America in this period was this aristocrat, if that's the word, from Guatemala, Mario Sandoval Alarcón, who virtually forced Colonel D'Aubuisson on the rest of the El Salvador hierarchy. And drugs were involved both in Sandoval's activities and in D'Aubuisson's activities. And if it's true, in the light of the recent revelations about how not only hundreds of thousands of, well, tens of thousands of Guatemalans have been killed, but also one American and the husband of another, which has very much brought the problem home to the United States, which is what I believe has to happen. There has to be this kind of consciousness raising in the United States. But if it is actually the case, as Clinton says, that all the aid has been cut off, I am sure that the G2 and the D2 of the Guatemalan military will do what they have done in the past, and in fact have been doing pretty continuously. They'll just rely more on drug trafficking, not just cocaine, which has been coming through for years, but increasingly heroin, because it's interesting that in the areas of Guatemala where there has been the most vigorous counterinsurgency, you now have serious planting of opium. It began in a big way about the time that the Afghanistan operation tapered off, and this has become a new source of heroin for the region, and some say will be increasingly important for the United States as well. I want to say something about Mexico, which is hardest for me to be brief about. We wrote a bit about it in Cocaine Politics, how the DFS, the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the lead security agency in Mexico, was set up with the aid of the CIA in Mexico, became, in effect, a licensing agency for the drug traffic. And we quote another author saying, who in turn is quoting from someone from the DEA, saying that a little pin saying you were in the DFS meant that people in the DEA were not allowed to touch them, which meant that they were, in effect, licensed to traffic in drugs. There was a lot of furor about this back around 1985 when an American DEA agent was murdered down in Guadalajara, I think it was, in the western side of Mexico. And it turned out how deeply involved the Mexican government and the Mexican ruling party, the PRI, were involved in the drug traffic. And really the whole dividing up of governorships is, in many of the provinces, not all of them, it's a way of dividing up the take from the drug traffic. So that the problem of corruption is, I think, further, much more articulated into the entire structure of the PRE than the idea that it's some remnant element that is still trying to hang on to the past. And it turns out, what people should really have known, I think, that what looks like a courageous crackdown on the drug traffickers in Guadalajara or in Tijuana is, in fact, a rearrangement of the drug traffic. You are cracking down on the West Coast drug trafficking because you are getting more money now from people on the East Coast. And that seems to be that instead of the fight within the party being a fight between traditionalists and modernists, as I say, there's probably some truth to that analysis, but another much more cynical analysis is that it's a fight between those people who are allied to the West Coast traffic and those people who are allied to the East Coast traffic, the so-called Gulf Cartel that we have just begun to hear about and are now told is even bigger than the Guadalajara cartel, which we used to be told was the biggest. And in all of this, Mexico is shaping up very much like Colombia, where we heard a great deal about the Medellin cartel, and then we finally heard that the Medellin cartel had been broken. What had actually happened was that all along, the government was much more in bed with the competing cartel, the Cali cartel, and would never have been able to break the Medellin cartel without the information and in fact, the death squads that were supplied by the Cali cartel. And it is true in a funny way that a kind of peace is beginning to return to Colombia, at least on the drug frontier, but that's because the Cali cartel has regained the monopoly which it more or less enjoyed before the upstart Medellin cartel tried to cut into things and were beaten down with the support of, among other things, millions of dollars of U.S. aid. I just simply want to close by saying it should make us aware of how totally corrupt these systems are, and that when our interventions are restricted to interventions with violence, whether we are beefing up police forces or the military or counterinsurgency forces, what we are doing is preserving a system, and I come back to Peru, a system which is so stratified, so hopelessly undemocratic, that we are involving ourselves in a war that will go on for a very long time, and one in which drugs is going to play a big role, and is going to play a big role because those drugs are profitable, because they are going to be shipped up here to the United States. And so we should stay out of those countries. Thanks very much.
Please talk further about media coverage of drug trafficking.
I have an entire chapter in Cocaine Politics about this very complicated problem. It isn't like it's not like some countries where the government says print this or don't print that. The basic problem is that particularly for the so-called press of record, the New York Times, the Washington Post, to almost as great extent the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times, their major source of information is the CIA. And they want to keep it that way. They're not going to get up like me and just sound off loose at the mouth about what the CIA is doing, because if they do that, the CIA is not going to maintain its traditional relationship with them. The New York Times cannot afford to contemplate something like that. So, and by the way, I became very aware of this press problem, which I think it's really where we should begin, is to change the attitude of the press. And I saw it firsthand because I was in Washington for about 6 months, during the Iran-Contra crisis. I had a very good journalist come to me. I mean, one of the good journalists. And I don't want to identify him, but he said, you know, I had the Oliver North story for 2 years and I never printed a word of it. You know why? I said, you know, wanting to hear him say it, why? He said, Oliver North was my best source. And this is why everybody in Washington knew about Oliver North. And it took a long time for it to be, the story to be broken. And when it was broken, it wasn't broken in the New York Times or the Washington Post. It was broken, I think, chiefly by the Knight Ridder papers. And those papers will tend to be better on drug issues and things like that because they don't have as big a stake in maintaining the CIA connection. And they actually, you know, journalism is supposed to reward you for scoops and things like that. And to some extent that works with the smaller press. It doesn't work with the New York Times. The government connection comes first. I actually sat in a secret hearing, and I talk about this in Cocaine Politics, in which all of the witnesses talked about Contras and drugs, Contras and drugs, Contras and drugs. The next day, the Washington Post ran a story on this secret hearing, saying, in effect, that this hearing had heard that hundreds of witnesses had testified that there was no connection between Contras and drugs. The exact opposite of the truth. The exact opposite of the truth. It was so wrong that 2 days later, the Washington Post printed a very small retraction. Actually, Congressman Rangel, whose committee it was, wrote a letter and he said, I insist this be published, and they wouldn't publish it. But they did print a very small retraction. That was from, I believe, July 22nd to July 24th, 1987. But on July 23rd, 1987, the Democrats, not even the Republicans, the Democrats in the Iran-Contra Committee took the false story and made it the basis of a staff report saying that hundreds of witnesses could find no connection between the Contras and drugs, which got printed up in the official Iran-Contra report, even though the story had been retracted 1 day later. Now, actually, it was the Republicans that put it into the report, but I began to realize that Washington is a city of games, and that this was an example of the kind of games that are played with public opinion, and that no politician in Washington wants to really seriously take on this CIA drug connection. The man who came closest to it, Senator Kerry, was a committee that I was working with, and he looked into the Contras. But this is a long answer, but I'm really, I feel this is all very important. And he had a drug pilot before the committee, and he asked him a question about a particular shipment. And the pilot's attorney jumped up and said, I see what you're trying to do, Senator Kerry. You're trying to drag the CIA into this. And Senator Kerry said, oh, no, 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 he said. I promised Senator Boren I would keep the CIA out of these hearings, and I am not bringing it in now. And that, I think, by the way, I very much admire that Kerry did what he did. He not only exposed Contra drug connections, but he got reelected. And I think it's more or less true that every single politician who in a major way has challenged the CIA in Washington, Senator Church I think of in particular, but all of them have failed to be reelected. And so that's one of the reasons that the solution to this problem is not going to come from Washington. It may come from Durango, but it's not going to come from Washington.
Is the war on drugs a form of social control?
Well, first of all, I imagine many people are in this room already know this, and that's perhaps why you're here. The United States incarcerates a higher percentage of its citizens than any other country in the world. And there's some pretty mean countries out there. You know, Indonesia, South Africa at one point, the Soviet Union, China. They're not as bad as the United States. And it impacts primarily on people of color. Partly because it's no coincidence, the drugs we tolerate are the drugs that whites like to consume, tobacco and alcohol, far and away the biggest killers, by the way. I mean, sometimes this is, we say we're doing this to save lives. Well, if we're going to save lives, we should outlaw nicotine and alcohol. But those happen to be the drugs of choice of the white majority. And it's changed, but originally drugs like heroin, well, it was opium originally, marijuana, if you go back in time, they were drugs of minorities. And in fact, it is incredibly racist. It's partly funny, but it's partly shattering to read the Federal Bureau of Narcotics reports from the 1930s about this is the reefer madness era, you know, but invariably it is some young Mexican-American took a toke on a marijuana cigarette and went home and killed his mother. You know, it was reported year after year in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics until they got what they wanted, which was the outlawing of marijuana, which took care of all these old Treasury agents who had nothing to do after the end of Prohibition. I mean, it was a case of target the minorities in order to make jobs for bureaucrats. I don't think it was primarily target them in order to control them. I think that in terms of something you could do something about, you could address the whole gamut of crazy drug policies that we have. It isn't just the CIA part alone that's responsible. The first thing of all are these laws that give the judges no choice but to send people away. So, you know, if it's a choice between having 4 ounces of cocaine or murdering your mother, it's probably better to murder your mother. You won't be in jail for as long. It's become ridiculous. But that's where we are, and it's not likely to change. I mean, it's the sort of thing that currently is set in concrete. But it has to change. And it's interesting, by the way, that this is an area where I see the left and the right converging. It's the status quo that wants to keep things going, and I never thought that, you know, you take a libertarian economist like Milton Friedman, I never thought I would, or William Buckley, I didn't think I'd ever have anything in common with these people. But they're saying this is terrible and we have to stop it, and it is terrible, and we do have to stop it. Now, you raised another question which I expected would be asked. Are we doing this in order to control minority populations? I think it's more the way it's worked out than the way it was intended. But it was certainly when Bennett was the head of the drug czar, as they call it. It's interesting they would use the word czar, if that's what we need in America is a czar. It's very clear that the conscious policy of Bennett was to make white middle-class Americans stop using cocaine. And he more or less succeeded. I mean, you actually do, it just shows you that government policies can make a difference. There was a drop in white middle-class consumption. What does that mean? It means that those white middle-class people who still consume cocaine, and there are quite a lot of them, they now go to black neighborhoods. It's more by, I think, indirection than by design, but it has aggravated the problem in the minority neighborhoods. And in many neighborhoods, like Oakland, for example, is just a few miles from where I live in Berkeley, it's a war zone down there. And young black males have to be very terrified of other black males, but they also have to be very terrified of the police, who may just rush up in a car, jump out, say, lie on the ground face down, spread your legs, and then they come and feel them all over looking for cocaine. They don't bother about search warrants and things like that, because it's a war on drugs, and in war you can do anything. Well, they really do just about anything to people in those neighborhoods. And I don't see how we can expect people to want to live in our country if we treat so many of them this way. So I think it has to change.
That was Peter Dale Scott on the politics of global drug trafficking. He spoke at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado in April 1995. Peter Dale Scott, former UC Berkeley professor and Canadian diplomat, has authored several books on drug trafficking. This program is produced by Alternative Radio, an independent award-winning weekly series. AR has produced a number of programs on drug trafficking and the drug war, featuring such voices as Noam Chomsky, Alfred McCoy, John Stockwell, Dan Baum, Gary Webb, and Angela Davis. To access our catalog, visit our website, www.alternativeradio.org. Again, website www.alternativeradio.org. To place a Visa or MasterCard order for the complete one-hour program you just heard, Peter Dale Scott, The Politics of Global Drug Trafficking, call us toll-free at 1-800-444-1977. Again, that toll-free number is 1-800-444-1977. Or you can send in your check. Printed transcripts are $9 even. Cassettes are $13 plus $1 for postage. The address, AR P.O. Box 551, Boulder, Colorado 80306. Michael Pastore recorded the program. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.